Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start ranting, share my screen. I don't know. I don't really have like anything super formal prepared. Um, but I have been loving using Slater, and even just, yeah, I don't know. Down to talk about and would love to even just have an open conversation about how y'all are even using AI outside of Slater as well, and maybe the relationship there. I guess to start, I feel like I know most of you, or I recognize most of you in some way, shape, or form. If you don't know me, I'm Corey. By day, I'm a brand designer at Webflow. By eves and weekends, I am a self-proclaimed Webflow tech lead, really just working with agencies and clients directly as a freelancer in that capacity, building stuff in Webflow and scoping and strategy and all the things that come with it, as well as custom code and all the fun things that go way beyond Webflow's native functionality, which is at the core of why I love Webflow specifically so much that you can even do that. So, um, oh, Jonathan, what's up? Also haven't seen you in forever. Uh, yeah, and candidly, before Slater and all that, my first like AI experiences was with GitHub Copilot. Ben Parker on the team at Webflow, as again, I'm guessing some people know of from Twitter and all that. He loves Copilot and got me talked into it. And has anybody used Copilot? Maybe yes, no, yes, Theo. So Copilot, the difference is, while you're coding in an IDE of VS Code, you can add comments, and then the comments within your code is what you use to engage with the AI. So you write a comment saying, make me some script that does this thing, and then in line as you hit return and tab, it brings back those results for you. And like it's pretty magical, especially because it also knows things like your clipboard and I think even like browser history and some of that. At least that's what it seems, because it's like spooky how accurate it is sometimes, and like basically reading my mind as I'm coding. And so for me, like as somebody, I would never ever probably go take a front end engineering position somewhere. But figured out I've been very comfortable with HTML and CSS for quite a long time. But JavaScript, honestly, for me, has been like the last 3, 4 years that I've gotten more and more comfortable. And I would still not consider myself a pro, but enough. I know plenty enough to be dangerous, is what I always say. And so I know enough that something like Copilot was awesome because I could get the start and I knew generally what I wanted to do, even like function and method names and things like that, and then it could just get me over that hump, right? Was the way that I loved using it. And I can even show a preview of that, of using that, if that's helpful. Um, and yeah, so that was my first kind of exposure to AI and code. And then, ChatGPT launched and it was all the rage. And like, to be very candid, like when people were, especially when ChatGPT first came out, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, it codes for me." I tried it numerous times and not once got it to like work well. Like it was always broken code, or like it didn't know what was going on. But again, as most of you has probably experienced, the last even few months has been like completely different. And I don't know which version of ChatGPT. Maybe Jack, you can answer this. We're using in Slater. But my gosh, it has gotten way faster and way more accurate. Like especially speed. I don't know what the heck happened, but like the first few times I used Slater, it was like the little dots running and is like thinking, and then now it's just like instantly, and I'm like, this is creepy how fast it is. I don't know, Jack. Do you have any notes there on that? What, like which versions it uses or whatever? Sick. Uh huh. Mm-hmm. Sick. All right. We got full access. That's awesome. Okay. And then maybe that's even part of the speed enhancement, I'm guessing, then, right? Is that it's using those newer versions, so it's just more responsive? Yeah. Nice. Love it. Yeah, so honestly, I think then just like coming full circle to at least today. Oh, I hear an echo. Maybe, yeah, there you go. Coming full circle to today, Slater, honestly, is probably what I go to first, at least in the last like month. Um, and especially because of the hot reloading, right? That I can work on scripts or multiple scripts in one space and get the experience of dropping the script into my Webflow site and not having to continuously republish. Which before Slater, I would do the code sandbox route. If y'all have seen that, that like Timothy Ricks and others in the community do, where you spin up a code sandbox, which technically I'm pretty sure you can do this with CodePen as well if you have a pro account, and they've had that for years. I've just never had a pro account as much as I do use CodePen a lot. And so that route is nice, but then it was separating the experience. Like I'd have to like use GitHub Copilot or Slater, or not even Slater. Yeah, I'd have to use GitHub Copilot and then paste into Code Sandbox, then refresh, and it was just like clunky. And Slater kind of consolidating this has been awesome. And then I think one thing I candidly haven't messed with yet is like I saw the tease of this concept now that you can use Slater as like your one single script and then use the page functionality in it to deploy the separate versions of the code to each page in Webflow so that you have this like genuine source of truth. I am super amped about that. Like, I just honestly haven't given it a try yet. And maybe this is another question even for Jack or anybody's like that I was curious about is just what is maybe the under the hood CDN or like deployment network of Slater? Because I think that's my one concern. Maybe not as much with freelance projects, but especially like as I've used it on Webflow projects, like certain pages we have get a ton of traffic. Like our homepage averages like 30,000 hits a second or something like that. Like it's a stupid amount of traffic. And like it makes me real nervous if we have any code that's not coming from either like directly on the page or, maybe like JS Deliver and some of that. But honestly, even that, like JS Deliver, we've hit like caps on like certain things and I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know, Jack, any other insights there on like how those things get deployed out of curiosity? Uh, oh, okay. Keep talking. It's cool. So, anyways, I guess I can share my screen and walk through at least some examples. I've used Slater. I'm trying to think even what I can share. I mean, safe space, right? We're not like recording this. Are we? Or like, will this be public after? Yes? Okay, so I'll be cautious. Uh, Let me share then. Let's just do this full window because there's not really anything. Um, yeah, so, I mean, here's my lowly little few examples in Slater. Um, and I would say, like the use cases here for me have always been two buckets. Bucket number one is modifying things. Um, so an example here is, yeah, this isn't really exposing too much. Like, so Webflow Conf coming up, so excited. And for the 2023 site, we are building all the online experience in Webflow and we are partnering with MemberStack actually to run registration, authentication, all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with MemberStack. It's just external tooling to control authentication and all that. And to be super transparent, it just has like way, way, way more functionality than native memberships on Webflow. And so as much as I would love to use, well, I'm getting some feedback. Dan St. Peter, could you mute, please? Maybe. Yeah, well, carry on. And so, yeah, one thing we wanted to do in that experience is some custom ways that we're like letting people select tickets and things. And so even just jamming with the MemberStack team, they had recommended one approach and kind of gave me part of this top script here on a way to consider how we could approach like controlling with their what's called their DOM package in MemberStack 2.0, where you can control and do programmatic things on the front end with plans and stuff. And so they gave me this starting point, and I was like, this is awesome. And then honestly, like, this is what's funny too, is like, I think the other thing I love about Slater and AI in general is like when you're just feeling tired and lazy, like candidly, I was working on this yesterday and I was just like exhausted, mentally just struggling in terms of just a lot of things going on with this project. And so it was so nice to be able to jump in here and let Slater do the vast majority of the work, where, I pumped in what I initially had, and then I just like used Slater to help me update the code to do a couple additional things I needed to do, right? And then I got to a point where this top part was working, and what this is doing is basically just like looking at checkboxes on a page that have an associated ID of ticket type, and then that ticket type has an ID of the like plan ID. And then it was, we were just grabbing that, and then on submission of a form, going and adding the plan for the person that's logged in. And so then we need to do a few other things like also remove. And then down here, if somebody went back to their ticket selection, we also wanted to like unload, make sure that we're pre-checking whatever they currently have selected. And so, like, honestly, 95% of this was done entirely by Slater. And there's just, like, little parts where I think the one thing that's worth always considering is, like, this AI, in my opinion, is only as powerful as, like, your own knowledge can back it up, because it's always going to miss stuff, right? Like, there were certain things in this where it's like, hey, I need to go, call... this right here, get current member from MemberStack, but like it wasn't smart enough to know that like we first need to pull in and like initialize the MemberStack DOM, and so connecting those dots, finding what's going wrong is I've always found really important to at least being efficient with AI, where like in the matter of minutes or so I'm getting most of these things solved. And then even something else, like while this one was fresh, because I was just working on it yesterday, is like, I'm sure this has come up, is like when there are errors, it's incredible that like some of this, to be honest, like I am not super familiar with the map method here. And so I was like, hey, this gave me an error. Here's the error. And then it is, again, smart enough to know that what the error is, how to possibly get around the error, right? And then go beyond it. And I think what's interesting though is like sometimes at the same time, like this specific chunk, I remember yesterday, I had this map error, it still wasn't quite getting it, and then it ended up causing more errors. And so what I ended up doing is just undoing the code in here back to where I knew it worked, and then repasting that in to Slater and just being like, okay, now we have more errors. Can we restart with this one? And then I tried to re-describe a bit more thoroughly what I needed to happen. And that was, everything I needed to be able to do it. So, yeah, that's one example. What else? Ratbook is a freelance project. Oh, this one's basic AF. Wait, no, here we go. Ratbook is a freelance project, and this was I think a fun example recently where I've already solved, not me alone, like people have solved for certain things, and like I'll show the live test site. I think this is supposed to go live today actually. People have solved for things like this, where you have these like auto playing tab experiences, and I even have a clonable on my Webflow profile for doing this. However, the way I've always solved it in the past has been like a rinse and recycle approach from other scripts I found. And so like, although I pretty well understood it, there was always like certain limitations with the like core way it was structured in the code that I've used in the past that would like create limitations. One limitation was like, if I want multiple versions of this tab block like we have here, using the same base code, but I only want one to be animated, or I want multiple to be animated and start at different times. Like that introduces new, requirements within that script that like are just hard to solve within the way the script was done before. So with this one, I was like, oh, sweet. Like maybe I'll just try starting fresh here. I'll like forget everything I've ever learned in terms of like auto playing tabs, and then just see what Slater can do out of the box. And ultimately, like the solution it ended up solving was like not that different than what I've seen before, but it was the game changer for me in this was that like as I would solve for one thing and then the other, right? So like first I solved for, can we just get the just basic tabs to work? No autoplay, nothing. And then just they're all done with custom code, right? This is not a tabs element in Webflow, especially because you have like, technically a link within a link here, not actually in the DOM, especially for Jonathan or anybody that's definitely conscientious of accessibility. I actually use this like link overlay approach, so you technically still have two separate links in here, but regardless, you can't do that with native tabs in Webflow. And so solving for basic functionality first, like clicking between, and then solving for them auto-playing, and then solving for this little element moving one step at a time. Doing that in Slater is so powerful because Slater knows all the context of where we came from to where we're going. And so it's just like, it's a really powerful approach. And so I'm saying all this out of the realm of just like, I guess it's a tip or just, hey, if nothing else, think about it next time, is that like, even if you have an existing code, sometimes it's almost easier to just let, or work with Slater to go from the beginning to then achieve what you're after, right? Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the highest level response is we love it. And so I think, if y'all noticed or caught the recent, I think it was like Tiny But Mighty live stream from Webflow, where they did announce, the throttle back of memberships and logic. Part of that decision, as I'm pretty sure they said in that live stream, is that is out of this recognition of, our core and most valuable part of our product is the designer. That's really what people, come for and what differentiates us. And in the way that the designer uniquely, because I just, please somebody tell me if this is ever wrong. It's like, I really think it's very, very unique that Webflow stays so true to HTML and CSS, at least within a visual interface, right? Every other web builder, framer, etc., abstracts that away to whatever proprietary thing they decide. You have no choice in that. And so it's very unique that Webflow stays true to that. And then that is what makes things like integrating a little custom code so easy, in a way, quote unquote easy. And so when tools like Slater and stuff come about, it just really is going to catalyze everything. And so I'm saying all that also out of like, I think Webflow, we're in this place where other things that I believe they announced in that live stream are like the designer APIs that are, I think, now in beta or alpha maybe with certain specific test external tools for testing. And so in other words, like we are starting to recognize that like maybe the most powerful path for Webflow in the near future or future is extensibility, right? And really this is not unique to Webflow. This is the same general concept of open source, right, or WordPress or any of their growth, is that when you can enable and allow access to growing the product as a community and an ecosystem, you will get there 100 times faster than trying to keep it all in-house internally, right? And so even, I mean, the example of, I mentioned earlier of like member stack in Webflow, like it's, our team internally, I am like mind bent every day by the talent of our engineers and all that. But it's still, like Webflow's still like 700, 600 and some people. Like, did you know that like Shopify has like, I think it's like 12,000 employees or something like that? Like Squarespace is like 4,000 employees. Like we are still McMicro compared to the other giants that in a lot of ways, we see in the community, we are still like quote unquote competing with. I wouldn't say really directly, especially something like Shopify. Like we all know Webflow e-commerce is no Shopify. I'll recommend Shopify all day. But the point is that like absolutely the other way. You know, I've had people that are like, they'll say, I want an e-commerce site. I'll say, here's your options. Honestly, Shopify is the Kleenex of tissues. But they'll start to use it and they just want to customize fonts and things more easily, and they'll ditch it for Webflow because, again, the designer experience in Webflow is just like, you know, very unique and powerful. And so I think we're in this state, all that to say, of like absolutely excited and embracing other tools. I would say the one thing that I know we hope, and I definitely hope we can get to with all of it, is the getting to a place where the designer and Webflow is extensible enough natively that we can get rid of all these freaking Chrome extensions. Like, don't get me wrong, I need to be abundantly clear that they are amazing. Like, the FinSuite extension saves me so much time every week on little things like, you know, accessing site-wide custom code or merging a combo class or whatever. But like, y'all, it's just it's generally a hacky way that we've like kind of been forced as a community into modifying the designer and using tooling on top of it. And so I think that's a lot of the focus around these designer APIs and things, is that all those teams and people that have that skill, you know, to create tooling on top of Webflow will hopefully one day be able to do this mostly natively. And so it'll be more secure. It'll be more powerful, like way more potential and access. And I think the thing that I hope, and I'm sure will always stay true as well, is that like, you know, Webflow, a comparison I sometimes make is like, you know, if you remember when smartphones came out and, you know, Android App Store, iOS App Store, you know, very different in terms of access. Maybe not as much today, but early days was like Android was open anything. Like, so you could download apps that would just rip your phone apart. iOS was like super, maybe overly strict back in the day, where it was like it took literally a couple weeks for your iOS app to get approved, and that's because of the stringent security vetting process to make sure that the quality of every app in the iOS ecosystem is good, right? Again, today I'm no expert on mobile app ecosystems, but you know, from what I've been exposed to, that is an analogy I've heard a lot, and I always think of that even with Webflow. That, you know, I would hope we will always stay in this path of like quality is always our top concern, and so that will extend to any app and tooling outside of it to make sure that like anybody's experience in the product, whether they're using additional tooling or external tooling on top of it or not, is consistent and high quality and reliable, right? Yeah, I don't know. Way long answer for a simple question. But yeah, I'm super excited, honestly, about just that bit of a pivot, as much as like when I joined the team at Webflow, this was like 2.5 years ago, you know, I saw a little glimpse of things like memberships. And it literally almost, this is so nerdy, like brought tears to my eyes because I was so excited. Because like just imagining the power of something like memberships natively, right? But then like fast forward and just seeing what the community has done, what y'all have done with tools like Slater, it's like, it's so obvious that, you know, there's a reason things like open source did become so powerful. And again, to be clear, Webflow won't ever go open source. It's just the same concept of an ecosystem and like external developer tooling. And so it's just like, yeah, it's super exciting to see what that potential could bring. Especially, I think, like, even, you know, obviously probably anybody here, Slater is a code-oriented thing. And I am very bullish that Webflow is a development tool, not a freaking design tool. You know, it's fine to disagree with that. I'm okay with that perspective. I think we just have this, like, challenge because Webflow sits in this, like, somewhat, honestly, like I always think of it like a valley, right? Like you have like development over here, like straight up just programming, engineering, hardcore, and then you have design, like Figma, Photoshop, whatever over here. And Webflow like really sits like in this valley between them, and there are other tools that sit in that valley, but again, they end up usually leaning one way or the other, more often towards design. Like Framer, as an example, is like definitely, you know, like there's a reason it's so intuitive to use, and that's great, and I'll recommend it for simple portfolios all day long, but like it's still ultimately a design-oriented tool. So as soon as you start hitting business requirements as a professional, as a freelancer, as an agency building business sites, as you know, maybe we've all experienced, like those requirements are the make or break of whether a tool is worth it or not, you know? And like, I'll never forget when the team I was on before I joined Webflow is where I found Webflow. And when we first found it, we did this whole analysis of all these other tools. And I'm also sorry that this has turned into a Webflow rant, not necessarily a Slater rant. but like we found all these other tools, and Webflow is one of them. And although it was like it seemed a little intimidating and hard to learn, I remember like my boss at the time, or my manager, who was like, he came from a coding background, and he was like, this looks like it's worth it, right? And he made the comment that he's like, we will use it until it can't meet a requirement that comes our way. And honestly, that day never came because of things like custom code, right? That you could layer on top of it. And so when we have things like Slater now that make that even easier, I don't know, it's just like, it's definitely going to change the game, right? And again, I think I'm just grateful to just genuinely, like, to be transparent, invested myself and skills and passion into a tool that we can still do that on top of pretty seamlessly with something like Slater or VS Code or whatever, right? Yeah, anyways. Rants. Oh yeah, Slater app and Webflow Marketplace. Let's go. I mean, I think like even that as an example, Theo, is like I think one of the designer APIs is custom code access. So the point being that like the idea would be you go into Slater, you then go to your settings or somewhere to log into your Webflow account, pick what sites. You've probably had that experience before if you use like JetBoost or some of the other tools. So you OAuth with Webflow, and then you could say, hey, Slater, just go put in the script in the site for me. Just click a button and it would just pump that in there. So it just saves you some steps of like going and manually pasting it and knowing where to put it, and all that. Yeah, so like those definitely I could see being possible. And I just, I candidly don't like know much on where or when or how. But I would hope there will also be a day where even some of the tooling is like, you don't have to even leave the designer, right? Imagine like how rad would it be, kind of like some of the Chrome extensions, that like you could just go in a tab in the designer and open up Slater, do all of your generation and modifying right there. Yeah, because like even, I think another thing that's like even that it's funny, I think I take it for granted in tools like Slater is even just like the like prettier functions, right? Like when you save, it just automatically formats and like does have some type ahead functionality and all that. Like you don't get any of that in the native custom code blocks in Webflow. And so even something like that alone, being able to do that natively and not having to leave the designer is like, woof, will be sick. Yeah. Omkar question, so is the designer API will be public? I don't know for sure. I mean, I from my unawareness of it, it's available for like developers that apply, right? So I think in theory anybody can get access, but it's not just like, anybody, like there still has to be an authentication process with our team, our DevRel team, to know who has access and who's building what and all that kind of stuff. Again, if you think about the whole iOS, Android concept, it's just making sure that we have this high quality, secure ecosystem. But ultimately, the goal is anybody that is able and wants to build an app on top of Webflow will be able to at some point in the future. So, yeah. LOL, remove the custom code fields. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about y'all, if y'all have any ideas on this. Again, this is not in any way, shape, or form an indicator of what's to come or anything, but I would love to even just see like a little more structure and organization around how custom code's handled on top of Webflow. Like even more similar to a traditional coding environment where you have like individual files, that you're referencing. So instead of having to just dump it all in, can I just say, all right, I want a new file. Here's the endpoint, whatever. And then like you can organize them, deploy them to different pages. I don't know. I also still have this deep dream of being able to use external CSS natively in Webflow. So I don't know if Jonathan left as an example. I know Jonathan was in here and I've seen on Twitter, he's been on the Versely train lately, which is great. And Versely is another no-code tool if you aren't familiar. And I think by default it's built on top of Tailwind, which is CSS utility first library framework. And so imagine a day, like, my gosh, if you could just literally grab the Tailwind link, CSS link, and just put it in Webflow. Webflow can parse all those classes and then let you use those classes natively in this, like, they would be like read-only, right? Or locked or something like that, because like it's not going to modify that source, of course, but you should at least be able to use them in the same way that you can put like any custom classes you want in an embed on the canvas and then type that custom class into the style panel, and it will work as you would expect it, just one-to-one. So like, to me, though, that's this other realm of like custom code extensibility that, like, again, I am one soul among 600 at Webflow, but I'll just say it's one that I bring up often because I just think like you're opening up a much larger audience of people, that would then maybe be more intrigued to use Webflow, especially if they're already familiar with external frameworks like Tailwind or Bootstrap, etc., at least in the CSS realm, which, like, candidly, no one's picking favorites on code these days, but I am a CSS junkie. Like, at the end of the day, JavaScript's fine, and it is so powerful, but I just, like, I love CSS so much, and to the point where I think maybe I get a little biased internally on, like, CSS can solve all problems, but yeah, anyways. Absolutely. Let's get Mason on the horn right now and say, Mason, this is what we're doing. Yeah, so I think a big one is what you just mentioned, that is a library, right? Or really, I think the highest level concept of this is what, like, Webflow does with clonables. So many other tools do with, like, even, again, think about like CodePen and some of those. You can duplicate other people's work as a starting point, and being able to do that in Slater or somehow leverage Slater in that way would be huge. And I can even give an example that I just launched, or just like put out this clonable a couple nights ago. That was this, like, it's like a pricing table that then as you get down to mobile landscape, it converts either the columns or rows to a swiper slider. Yeah, thank you. It was, honestly, I'm trying to get in this habit of, like, when I build these weird things like this for clients, I'm just going to say, I'm going to flip this into a clonable because somebody else will have some time saved. Regardless, inevitably, I got a DM the next day, hey, this is broken. Can you help me? And it's like, I would love to, but y'all, my time is, like, limited. I got 2 kids and, life and all that, it happens. And so this is where it's like, how epic would it be if, the code that I currently in that clonable, for example, is just in the page settings, but it would be rad if that code, I just kept it in Slater. And then when somebody clones the Webflow project, they can know, oh, sweet, this is in Slater, and I can, like, leave a link in the code snippet, or somehow they can access that snippet in Slater, duplicate it, and then use Slater to modify it for their needs. Because, like, the example is why that person broke the clonable is because they wanted to switch the slider from starting at mobile landscape to tablet. And in order to do that, you have to change some styling, which they figured out. But then in the custom code, you need to change, like, at what browser width the code starts running for the swiper slider, right? And so, even if they're not familiar with JavaScript, they could, thank you, yeah, those links are great. And they could use Slater to be like, hey, Slater, I want to use this on tablet now. Can you update this some way? And, like, Slater might be smart enough to know, oh, yeah, here, we're changing minimum width on this size, we're going to adjust it to this size. Those kinds of things is where I think it could be really, really powerful. And then, like, in that same realm, something else that, like, it makes me think of is other code-based tooling that are really popular in the Webflow community. For example, FinSuite attributes. Super powerful, super epic. However, my biggest beef with FinSuite attributes, and to be clear, I use them. They're great. But my beef with them is that since they're all, from the sounds of it, they're all, written in TypeScript, compiled, and deployed to JS Deliver, which, again, is great. But the issue is, if I, as somebody that at least is semi-familiar with JavaScript or has access to something like Slater, if I want to modify that code, I can go get it from the JS Deliver, but all of the minified and compiled JavaScript is just not semantic, because that's, like, on purpose. It makes it less characters and more efficient. but it becomes not semantic. In other words, I cannot read it because like I don't know what const a means or is referring to. Like a variable name of just a letter is useless to somebody that's trying to understand and modify the code. So the difference I'm getting at is something like Slater. It's really interesting to think about, like, if people can store and deploy, to a CDN from Slater natively, and then if somebody wants to use that, they can use it directly, just like they use a FinSuite attribute. Just give me the endpoint and some documentation and we're good to go. However, if there is the edge case where you want to modify that library or that script, because at the end of the day, there's like several FinSuite attributes that are like not their own origination. Like there's like, a table of contents one and things like that are like, those are other libraries. They're just kind of claiming and modifying and exposing. Again, no shame on them. Like, this is the beauty of the web, that we can recycle those things. My point is that like sometimes those are simple enough scripts that, you could use something like Slater to pretty easily modify for your specific use case. And so like, if that makes sense, Slater can act as this different kind of mediary between, just having open-ended libraries that you can't really have control over or modify easily, or, having libraries that you can take and use AI to help you modify it for your use case. Yeah, I don't know. That's some ideas. I feel like there's definitely others. Honestly, the whole thing I mentioned earlier that y'all are doing with deployments, of having kind of the one that then separates to each page, is huge. And so I think, I mentioned this to you, Jack, is like, to me, I love Slater, and we just need to start marketing this better, y'all. Like, I think those are the things, like, I would have no idea that existed unless I literally happened across, I don't even remember now, was it a tweet or something? And so I think it's in this realm of like, I think just really a big next step for Slater is presentation in this way, is like, landing page and open it up. And maybe some of that's on purpose, as we're like early days of like, not anybody can just join. There's still kind of like gated access. So anyways, yeah, those are the thoughts. That like, I think you're spot on in this use as learning, because at least from my, I can only speak from my own experiences. Like, I have tried to read books, I have tried to take courses and things on how to learn like JavaScript, and honestly, I never find that I've learned much out of them to be useful. What I have always learned, everybody learns differently, but what I always have learned the most from in a usable, hireable way is real things. Like, I have a requirement, I need to build this thing, I just need to figure it out. And because of tools like Slater and Webflow, not only allowing me to then learn how to do it, but like the core thing being that like when you're using Slater, for example, what it's producing is like the same exact code that somebody that's maybe been writing code for 20 years, would write from scratch, but it's doing it instantly. And so my point in all that is like, even with Webflow, there is this very authentic, timeless layer to these tools that, as a comparison to other tools in the space, like is unique. And so like Webflow as an example, again, visually in Webflow, you're just using HTML elements and CSS styling. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript has literally been the native languages of browsers for, 20, 30 years now. Like, maybe not JavaScript, I guess, but the point being, like, a metaphor I've shared a lot is woodworking, right? So I love just casually doing woodworking myself, and there's this concept that it's like, anybody can go to the store and buy a cabinet or something that is pre-built out of wood, but then, all they have to do is follow instructions and bolt it together. But doing that, they will not learn anything about like the type of wood, its longevity, how sturdy or stiff or firm or soft it is, right? So their knowledge only goes so far, right? Like the almost like biblical metaphor of this is even, if you give somebody a fish, they'll eat for a day. If you teach them to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime, right? And so the way I put it with like Webflow is like, and woodworking is like using Webflow. Yes, there's a learning curve, or using Slater. Yes, there's a learning curve, and maybe you won't get it right the first, second, even 100th time. But the point is, all that way that you're learning things, you're learning about the medium you're creating for. You're learning about, like in the wood analogy, you're learning how to cut wood, and then learning why different woods cut differently, or why different woods stain differently. Like, and so there is inherent value that is very timeless in that, and it's like so hard, candidly, what we were just talking about Jack, and like marketing it is really, really hard. Like even Webflow internally, we struggle with this like all the time. Like I'll bring up like, I really think our core value in so many ways is that we stay true to HTML and CSS, and that people will then learn those things so they can take their skills beyond the tool itself later, right? And unfortunately, we live in this world today where like most things are marketed, or even consumers purchase most things based on that initial, I want satisfaction now, and so they're like, well, if I can't figure it out in 5 minutes, it's trash. And it's like, I think you're missing the point. Like if you put a little time in to learn this, like I'm telling you, these skills are timeless. I've always said that too, that like people I talk to, I often like teach people how to use Webflow. And a lot of people have made the comment like, well, what happens if I spend all this time learning Webflow and then it just like goes away? And I'm always like, anything can happen in the world. The only constant is change. And sure, maybe that would happen. I don't think it will, but maybe it will. And the point is that you will have learned skills you can absolutely take beyond Webflow, right? Like you have learned about HTML and CSS that like if you had to go look at some raw code, or even just inspect a browser, like if you go to any web page and right click and go to inspect, you will now be able to make sense of what some of that code means, and then use that as knowledge to build and design things. And like, especially you as a designer, like that is the other thing that is so valuable, is like you then, back to the woodworking analogy, you can design things with those functions in mind to know the best way and most efficient way that they will then go from design to a full working website, right? So anyways, love the story. Thank you so much for sharing that. Seriously, made my day. I think you nailed it. There's just so much value in the education and all of this. That goes beyond just the satisfaction of solving a problem right away. So yeah. If no one else has a quote, the one I can share, the one I tweeted yesterday, which was from Haladur, who started Ueno, an agency, a while back. He is just an incredible human being. And in his talk at Figma Config yesterday, he made this comment about when they built Ueno, who ended up doing projects with the biggest tech companies at the time. He made this comment that like you don't have to know everything to build anything or to create anything. And that hit for me. I'm just a nerd about metaphors and sayings, but I think it's relative to things like Slater, because like, you don't need to know all about JavaScript and these codes, but you can build almost anything by just knowing enough about what to tell Slater or things. So yeah, that's it. Boom.